Good evening and welcome to the fourth short lectures on the history of the Italian civilization and literature. We have seen until now the decadence of the Western Roman Empire and the descent of the Italian peninsula into a spiral of wars and invasions. We have described the end of the long-distance commerce, the decay of the Roman roads, and the decline of urban population. We've also examined the rise of new social structures that provided some security to the people of the Dark Ages, the castle and the monastery. After outlining the general framework, we can now take a closer look at the literature of the Dark Ages. In Italy, this remained a Latin literature for about 6 centuries after the fall of the Western Empire. We shall focus on few Latin authors whose works are important for understanding the Middle Ages in Italy. 2 of them lived already during the Ostrogothic domination, and their lives were inextricably connected to the events of that age. Aurelius Cassiodorus and Severinus Boethius. Flavius Magnus Aurelius Cassiodoro belonged to an eminent family of Sculletium, today called Squillace, in Calabria. His father had covered important positions under King Odoacer. He helped his son to start a career in the high administration under Theodoric the Greek, and Cassiodorus climbed to the very top of their career by becoming a Magister Officiorum, a superintendent of the highest state offices. We know quite a lot of his political activity from his letters. Cassiodorus understood that a new age had started in Italy with the Ostrogothic domination, but he was equally aware of the cultural hegemony of the Latins, which implied also their dominance in the social life. He therefore stuck to the traditions of the best Roman aristocracy by respecting Roman institutions and laws and by treating Roman senators as if they still had effective powers. He consistently pursued Theodoric's design to integrate the Ostrogoths in the country that they had conquered, a design that granted to Italy 30 years of peace. He was always loyal to the Ostrogoths. He also wrote a history of them, a work now lost, the De Rebus Gestis Gothorum, which contained precious information on the origins of the Ostrogoths and on the Amals, the ancient lineage to which Theodoric belonged. Only a small portion of the information contained in the 20 volumes of Senator Cassiodorus could be preserved in another work written by another Ostrogoth, Jordanes, who had had the opportunity to read Cassiodorus' work a long time before. Cassiodorus' history of the Ostrogoths should be seen within the framework of the author's political design. To learn about their own remote past and traditions would have predisposed the Ostrogoths to the respect of the even more illustrious traditions of the country that they had conquered. It would have made them feel closer to the Romans and to the ancient Greeks rather than to the Huns, the Vandals, and the Lombards. Another political goal of Cassiodorus was to present the kingdom of Theodoric as a sort of restoration of the Augustine Principate, in which the authority of Theodoric was seen more as a charismatic primacy that didn't deprive the Senate of its dignity. Of course, by then the perspective was no longer that of an empire, but that of a Gothic Roman country. To that country, each of the 2 people, each of them subject to a different set of laws, could contribute with their quality the military valor of the Ostrogoths and the superior civilizations of the Latins. Cassiodoro hoped in a future in which both people would be subject to a single set of laws, respected by everyone. It was a vision that Cassiodoro resumed in the concept of civilitas, which implied the respect of the values of the Roman civilization. Theodoric, with his many years in power and with the prestige of his relationship with the Roman Senate, with the Pope and with Constantinople, was highly regarded by the kings of other Germanic peoples, settled in the territories of the former Western Empire. Finally, the religious dimension played also a role in defining Theodoric's kingdom. The Ostrogoths were followers of the teachings of Arius, a presbyter of Alexandria, who had lived 2 centuries before. Teachings that the church regarded as heretical. Under Theodoric, the Arians had their own churches and bishops in Italy, and the Ostrogoths were tolerant in all religious matters. So Theodoric hoped to mediate between the traditional values of the Roman patriciate and those of intransigent Christianism. However, all those delicate equilibria were eventually disrupted when the Byzantine emperors decided to become the champions of the Christian orthodoxy. This brought the Pope closer to them, and Theodoric found himself politically isolated in a country where the Ostrogoths were a very small minority. But before things deteriorated too much, Theodoric died in 526. He had no sons, and on his deathbed he disposed that his grandson would succeed him. However, Athalaric was still a child, and his mother, Theodoric's daughter Amalasuntha, held the power as a regent on his behalf. Amalasuntha continued to enjoy the loyal support of Cassiodorus. However, with the time, Amalasuntha lost the favor of several Ostrogothic chiefs, and, to make matters worse, the designated heir of Theodoric, Athalaric, died. At a certain point, she must have felt in danger if, as it is reported, she was planning to flee to Constantinople. Then, in a particularly difficult moment, her cousin Theodahad obtained from her to be associated in the regency, but then he deposed and imprisoned Amalasuntha in the lake island of Bolsena, where she was murdered a few months later. At this point, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian took her assassination as the pretext to claim back Italy that had been entrusted to Theodoric 50 years before. Justinian had ascended to the throne in 527 after crushing a rebellion in Constantinople and after engaging in a war against the Sasanian Empire. Justinian had set himself the goal of restoring the unity of the empire. He first obtained the support of the Ostrogoths for his operations against the Vandals in northern Africa, but once he conquered the Vandalic kingdom and gained control of the entire North African coast, Justinian turned against Italy and sent his trusted general Belisarius to put an end to the Ostrogothic kingdom. And this is how, in the year 535, the Gothic-Byzantine War started. Belisarius, a veteran of the Persian and Vandalic wars, sent his troops to the south of Italy first, where the Ostrogoths were less numerous. After conquering Sicily, his troops marched towards Rome along the Tyrrhenian coast. There was soon an ominous sign of things to come. Naples was the first city to close its gates to the invading army, so it was besieged, and after a few weeks, some Byzantine soldiers found in an ancient aqueduct a passage into the city. They reached the city unseen and managed to open a gate, in front of which Belisarius' troops had been waiting. A mass slaughter of the population followed. This massacre made clear to the Ostrogoths in Rome what their fate was going to be. They deposed the cowardly Theodahad and proclaimed General Witiges as their new king. He had gained years before on the battlefield his reputation of valor, and he was regarded as clean from the intrigues and the cultural contamination of the Latin society. This was the end of the integration strategy pursued over many years by Cassiodorus. Under Witiges' leadership, the Goths struck back, and a few months later the Byzantines found themselves under siege in Rome, after Belisarius himself narrowly escaped death during the first battle under the city walls. I won't resume here the 18 years of a war which ravaged Italy like no other before. Rome was taken 5 times, 3 times by the Byzantines and 2 by the Ostrogoths, frequently with great destruction and loss of lives. The metropolis that used to have over 1 million residents would end up with a population of a village, less than 10,000 people. Other prosperous cities met a tragic fate, like Milan, in which all the male citizens were reportedly slain by the Ostrogoths. The astute and very experienced Belisarius eventually prevailed on Witiges, but then the Ostrogoths regrouped under a young and valiant king, Totila, and when, after years of war, Totila fell in combat, they went on fighting under King Teia, also killed in the very last desperate battle. Over those 18 years, the fields of Italy had been laid waste and countless city plundered. The misery of the country was increased by the Justinian plague, a pandemic similar to the Black Death, which will devastate Europe 800 years later. After the Ostrogoths were finally defeated in 553, nothing of them remained, and Italy found itself deep into the Dark Ages. But let's now come back to Senator Cassiodorus. He saw the collapse of all he had done in his prudent, industrious life. He was 50 when the war started, an age in which the men of his times were already old. Yet Cassiodorus managed to start a second life. He quit his career, not without making his letters public, where his statesman work is documented. Then he retreated in Vivarium, a monastery that he had founded in his native region. Cassiodorus made of Vivarium an oasis for the secular and religious culture. He organized a collection and a copy of the manuscript that he has seen so many times being destroyed during fires and plunders. It became a shelter for the cultivated persons of his age, everywhere oppressed and impoverished in those savage times. He also wrote a lot, the Historia Ecclesiastica Tripartita, much appreciated during the Middle Ages, a chronica stretching from Adam to the year 519, then commentaries to the Psalms and to other religious texts. And then the Institutiones in 2 parts, the first dedicated to biblical and Christian knowledge, and the second to the secular knowledge. We find in this work the encyclopedical character typical of the works of the Dark Ages, dictated by the urgency to save a knowledge at risk of being lost. In Cassiodorus' work, we perceive the ideal of a community in which different persons live in harmony, free to follow their intellectual interest, a situation that Cassiodorus describes as an anticipation of paradise. We no longer know the exact location of Vivarium, but Cassiodorus, who had a very long life and was definitely defined the savior of the Western civilization, remains an example of resilient, indefatigable man of letters, constantly fighting against barbarity and war. Contemporary and colleague of Cassiodorus was another great intellectual, Anicius Mallius Torquatus Severinus Boethius, was born in Rome in the year 580. He belonged to an ancient patrician family, one of the first to embrace Christianism. He also enjoyed the protection of the prominent senator Symmachus, of whom he married the daughter. Since his early youth, Boethius covered important institutional positions and enjoyed the personal favor of Theodoric. He became consul, then magister officiorum. Even his 2 sons were made consuls simultaneously. In 522, he was immensely rich and powerful, and immensely respected for his great culture and for his many works. He had a deep knowledge of Greek, by then rare in Rome, and he knew the works of the Greek philosophers. He was an expert of the disciplines of the trivium and the quadrivium. He wrote books on arithmetic, music, astronomy, geometry, and commentaries to Aristoteles, of whom he translated several works. He also translated and commented Porphyry. He had a special interest for logic, which he communicated to the Middle Ages, so that he was later regarded as the father of scholasticism. He wrote treatises on syllogism and on theology, which lead us to think that he was a Christian, although his faith is not evident. Boethius wished to bring to the Greek philosophy into the Latin world. By approaching the Neoplatonics, and Porphyry in particular, he was trying to harmonize Plato and Aristoteles and to show their substantial agreement. He had understood that the millenarium intellectual exchange between Italy and Greece was about to end, and he wanted to provide his compatriots with the tools of the Greek thought before the distance with Greece became unbridgeable. For many years, Boethius' project harmonized with the political situation in Italy, until a new Byzantine dynasty started to pursue the reunification of Christianism by getting rid of the heresies. In 523, Emperor Justin issued an edict against Arianism, ordering the surrendering of Arian churches to the Christians. Theodoric felt betrayed by the Pope and the Roman aristocracy when a Roman senator who had written letters to Justin was accused of high treason. Boethius, who had spoken courageous words in his defense, was also accused. He was submitted to an unfair trial, quickly followed by a death verdict. After that, he was imprisoned near Pavia, where he wrote his most famous book, The Consolation of Philosophy. The book is written in a Latin still similar to that of the classical prose. It is divided in 5 parts, each one introduced by a hymn in verses. It is the spiritual testament of Boethius, who didn't try to display the serenity of Socrates in the face of his imminent death. Boethius used to have everything he could have wished for in his life. He has now lost everything: his family, his friends, his wealth, his library, his social role. A barbaric execution awaits him. The brutality of what lies ahead is not mitigated by the self-deceit that will be a passport to heaven. This is one of the reasons why this is one of the great spiritual texts of all times. The book is in dialogic form. Boethius imagines to talk to a woman who visits him in a dream. She is the personification of philosophy. The word philosophy had then a wider meaning than today. It meant inquiry, our personal search for the meaning of what happens to us and around us. The woman wipes Boethius' tears away and comforts him with her reasonings, among which mainly 2, that all great men had to endure suffering, and that suffering is necessary to life, because it enables us to understand it and to love it. The book has a Platonic character. God has created and governs the world. It might appear to us that evil is prevailing in this world. Our lives lead us to this conclusion sometimes, but our earthly existence are short, and we cannot base our judgment on the world on them. What might appear as bad today might later turn out to be good, to be necessary for the realization of good, in accordance to laws that elude us. In order to understand the world, which is eternal, we should look at it sub specie aeternitatis, i.e. from the point of view of an eternal being, God. Therefore, we shouldn't complain about the presence of evil and sorrow in this world. Since our souls are immortal, they should, in this life, tend to the true and eternal goods. Our rationality can help us to detach ourselves from inauthentic goods, which can any time vanish by the play of fortune. Wealth, glory, fame, etc. The initial sorrow recedes. The tone of the book becomes more elevated and serene, without any bitterness. There isn't any trace of superstition, no obsession with sin, no repudiation of life. Boethius explains how wicked people are the most unlucky of men, because they are not sharing good, which is the element that establishes our community with God, who is the supreme good. Because of the age of decadence in which it was conceived, and because of the dramatic circumstances in which it was written, Boethius' work fills us with admiration. As Bertrand Russell wrote in his History of Western Philosophy, during the 2 centuries before his time and the 10 centuries after it, we can't think of any European man of learning so free from superstition and fanaticism. Boethius had an immense influence on the Middle Ages, until the age of Francesco Petrarca in Italy and of Geoffrey Chaucer in Britain. The Church made a saint of Boethius. Although Boethius doesn't mention the Gospel in the Consolation, the grey-eyed woman, who is the personification of philosophy, is described as Athena, the Greek goddess of knowledge, and in fact, the inspiration source of the Consolation is Stoicism rather than Christianism. Boethius has strived to bring the classical thoughts to Italy. Exactly in the time when Justinian closed the academy founded by Plato in Athens about 1,000 years before, and thereby Justinian ended the classical age. Boethius represents, therefore, the point of junction between classical Stoicism, that of Cicero and of Marcus Aurelius, and the Middle Ages, which learn from Boethius the Aristotelian logic. Furthermore, Boethius transferred many other ideas to the Middle Ages, among them the taste for allegoric representation and the powerful image of the wheel of fortune, ubiquitous during the Middle Ages. This and other powerful images and ideas can be found in this strange, unique book of Senator Boethius, the first of the medieval scholastics and the last of the ancient Romans. In the next short lecture, we will examine an equally obscure and little-known period of the history of Italy. We will examine the Lombard or Langobardic kingdom. Thank you very much and see you soon.